This all culminated in Lyndon Johnson going on TV and addressing a joint session of Congress and a national televised audience to help civil rights legislation get unstalled in the Senate, and finally we see the passage of the landmark bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As a side note along these lines, we had the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides at Mary Washington here a few years ago now, and due to our relationship with James Farmer, who was a professor here back in the day, it was a big deal here on campus. We had a billboard on Ball Circle asking, "Would you ride the bus?" It's an important question to think about in a serious way. I remember asking students, and virtually all of them said, "Of course." But frankly, while I think incredibly highly about the students here at Mary Wash, I don't think most of them would. I don't think people fully appreciate the sacrifices that the Freedom Riders and other civil rights movement participants made. The idea of legitimately risking your life and at a minimum guarantee of getting beaten by nightsticks and police, not being able to fight back, and the idea of just sitting there and proving your peaceful protest by letting police beat you. I mean, someone like John Lewis who gets his head caved in, all these sorts of things. It's far more intimidating when it's a real rather than a theoretical question. It's something to think about in a serious way. The personal component of the civil rights movement and the very real sacrifices people made. Compare that to a lot of what we see today with, people protesting, the hashtag activists on the internet, UMW students chalking the sidewalk in the yearly abortion fight we have, and all the silliness that goes on there, painting the rock for your protests and whatnot. These are very real forms of expression, and they're important, but they don't even begin to compare what the people in the civil rights movement went through. If you learn nothing else from this class, I really want you to take a moment and take to heart the lengths people had to go to so they could do something as simple as giving black people equal treatment under the law in the most basic of ways. But back to the Civil Rights Act itself. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did a number of things, including authorizing the national government to end segregation in public education and public accommodations. At this point, we saw the beginning of the partisan realignment. While the Republican Party had traditionally been the one that was more supportive of civil rights, in 1964 they chose conservative Barry Goldwater from Arizona as their presidential nominee, at least in part because of his opposition of the Civil Rights Act. Goldwater, of course, lost in a landslide, giving Johnson and the Democrats an electoral mandate and support for continued legislation along these lines. Speaking of that continued legislation, the next major civil rights accomplishment was in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The main provision here authorized the Justice Department to suspend restrictive electoral tests in southern states that had a history of low black turnout. Things like poll tests and grandfather clauses would no longer be allowed, and the federal government was going to take an affirmative role in helping black people vote. In particular, the law said that they could send federal officers to register voters directly, and states had to obtain pre-clearance from the Justice Department before changing their electoral laws. The Supreme Court recently suspended this pre-clearance provision, arguing that the formula for saying which states were covered by it and which states weren't was outdated, and that if Congress could come up with a new way of deciding who had to get their changes pre-cleared, then that could be constitutional. But we know with our current polarized Congress, along with denials that institutional racism exists, that will never happen. After these two pieces of landmark legislation moved responsibility in the area of identifying and eradicating civil rights abuses to the federal bureaucracy. The focus became targeted on the outcome of local practices. The key here was that investigators did not have to investigate and prove a specific act, only that there was a reasonable suspicion of discrimination. This was important because proving specific discrimination beyond all reasonable doubt is incredibly difficult, so lowering the legal threshold made it much easier to advance cases based on violations of civil rights. This is especially true because as we go into the 1970s, we enter the world of de facto segregation, or segregation based on practices, rather than de jure segregation based on law. The classic example here is in housing laws where realtors wouldn't sell certain houses to African Americans, creating black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. The Jim Crow era was technically over and legal segregation was gone, but we still were very segregated in practice, and this continues obviously through today.